Welcome to our YouTube channel. I'm Dr. Charlotte Pence, and I direct the Stokes Center for Creative Writing. And we are here today with Shanthi Sekaran, who writes for 8 to 13-year-olds as well as adults. Her most recent young adult novel, Boomi's Boombox, delivers a powerful story about grief, family, and friendship that follows a young girl who accidentally travels back in time to meet her dad as a child. And her most recent adult novel, Lucky Boy, was named an IndieNext Great Read and NPR Best Book of 2017. She recently ended a stint writing for the acclaimed NBC series New Amsterdam. Shanthi lives in Berkeley with her family and cat named Frog, and today she's going to talk about writing outside of your experience. We are very lucky to have her.
My name is Shanthi. It's great to be here. I'm going to, as Charlotte said, talk to you about writing outside of your own experience. This can happen, if you're a fiction writer, if you're a memoirist, it's something we're all called on to do at some point in our writing journeys. It could involve writing completely out of your own culture, out of your own experience of a trauma or of a time period, or it could just be, a point of biography in a character's life. So I'm going to focus a lot on character. And when talking about my own experiences writing, I'm going to be referring to a couple of books. One of them is Lucky Boy. This is my last adult novel that I wrote, came out in 2017. It's about a young woman who's undocumented from Mexico and ends up in California, as well as a Berkeley couple who are trying to have a child. So that's Lucky Boy. And then Boomi's Boombox is the other book I'm going to be talking about. That just came out last month, May 2023. And it's for young readers for 8 to 13-year-olds. So I'll be referring to Boomi's Boombox as well. So writing outside of your experience, a big fear around that is slipping into appropriation of a culture, appropriation of somebody else's trauma or somebody else's experience. There's fear around doing it badly, as there should be. There are ways to write outside of your experience and to do it well. And I'm going to do my best to share with you today everything that I know. So I'm super low tech. So instead of a PowerPoint, I've made these cards. This is the first one. Why me? This is a question that you really need to ask yourself when you are starting to write your story. It's important to ask yourself, should I be writing this story? Maybe you shouldn't be. You are entitled as a writer, especially a fiction writer, to write whatever story you want. I believe that. Not everybody believes that, but I feel like, you should have a chance to write whatever story you want. There's still a question of whether you should, whether this is your story, whether this is the time that you should write this story. There's still a question in there. And so I want to be mindful of that. It's not, we don't all have carte blanche to write every story. We really do have to be prepared to do it right. So a couple things on this. Figuring out if you're the person to write this story. First, you have to ask yourself, am I willing to do the research that is going to be required to do this? Secondly, how am I going to do this? And I'll go into that more when I'm talking about Boomi's Boombox a little later. And thirdly, I think this is very important. What are you bringing to the conversation when you're writing about a certain issue, a certain experience? What are you bringing that is new, a new layer of discovery or of discussion to the story that you're trying to tell? So that's one way to approach it. With Lucky Boy, I was telling the story of Soli, who is from Mexico. I'm not from Mexico. I was born in the US and my parents are from India. She's undocumented. I'm not undocumented. She goes through a lot of experiences that were nowhere near my own. So I had to be mindful of that and ask myself, what am I bringing to this? And on the Kavya is the other main character. On her side of the story, she was Indian American. She did live in Berkeley, just like me, but she was going through some pretty difficult fertility struggles, which I didn't have to do myself. So I had to ask myself again, like, what am I doing here? Am I prepared to do the research and really do this right? The thing that I believe I brought to Lucky Boy, the new element in the conversation, is that I brought this question of, when people are immigrants in the United States, does their country of origin influence how they're treated? And my book examined that question. Of course, I didn't know that it was examining that question until well into the writing of it. So I really did have to get started on the story before I really knew what the big question was. You can go that way. You can also really dig into a big philosophical question that the book might be asking you. With Lucky Boy, the big philosophical question was, how can one person's act of love lead to another person's devastation? That was sort of a big philosophical question. That was what I was most interested in. So, don't write a book because you think it's going to be a bestseller. Don't write it because it's ripped from the headlines. Write it because it asks of you these questions, and write it because you absolutely have to, and because you have to be the person to tell the story. You're not always going to be, so give yourself some leeway there. Second card, facts. Facts seem very basic and very obvious, but I think they're really important for when you're writing outside of your own experience. Facts are something that will give you a cushion of knowledge when you're embarking on telling a story that's not your own. For Boomi's Boombox, for example, I had to learn a lot about what it was like for South Asian people in Britain in the 1980s. And I wanted to know, just to begin with, the statistics. What were the populations? Who came over to Britain from which country and why? Same with Lucky Boy. Why do people cross the southern border into the United States? What are the sort of economic forces south of the border that are driving that? Where did those originate? How many people come across the border every year, and how do they get there, and what are the dangers? So these are the basic pieces of information that are important to know to tell the story properly, but also they're important to know in order to kind of release yourself and give yourself a launching point to tell a story. So you have a foundation of factuality, and that in a way allows you to jump off and tell your beautiful story and be creative and be inventive. So that's facts, very important. My third point is all about voices. When you're researching, it's always important, I believe, to move beyond the facts and get to the stories of people who did live the experience that you want to write about. You can look at testimonials, you can look at memoirs, you can look at interviews, you can do your own interviews. For Lucky Boy, I started off, one of the first things I read was this book called Underground America, and it was a collection of personal testimonials by people who were undocumented and living in the United States. It was just their stories. It was some of the things that they've been through. It gave me insight into how they lived, into in some way the psychology of being undocumented. I did a ton of interviews, and I got really good because I had to. It's not my natural strength, but I got really good at asking people if they would speak to me. And I was really honest about the project that I was doing. I described the novel as best as I could. People were pretty open. I think that maybe people are more open to novelists than they are to journalists, because there is that cushion of fiction that they're working around. So I interviewed people who had been foster parents, people who had been adoptive parents. I got to speak to a couple people who had been undocumented themselves in the US. I found that, speaking to one person would create a chain of references. So one person would be like, oh, well, you should talk to my friend over there, or you should check out this book. So it became sort of a rolling process of research, and just the world kind of opened up to me the more that I took risks, and the more that I asked for people's help. And so many people's help went into this book. For Boomi's Boombox, just quickly, I did also feel that there was a danger of appropriating the experiences of others, because like Boomi, I'm of Indian origin, but unlike Boomi, I grew up in the 80s in the US, and the 80s in Britain it was a very different place, especially for South Asians. And I started to discover this as I talked to a few people. So I interviewed a couple friends who were British and Indian and had grown up in the UK in the 1980s. And it was through talking to them that I really started to understand how difficult life was for people, especially kids in the 80s, who were South Asian and growing up in Britain. And that kind of informed the story that I was willing to tell. I decided after talking to them that it wasn't maybe it wasn't my story to give the real raw reality of that life. That one of them was a writer. He would do a splendid job of it, and it wasn't my job. So instead, I created kind of an allegorical reality that reflects prejudice and reflects what immigrants were going through, but wasn't it wasn't the hard experience that I didn't live through. So sometimes talking to people will teach you what you shouldn't step into, and where you should draw your limits. And then let's see, we've got voices, we've got facts, we've got body. Your body. Your body is very important in the writing of somebody else's experience. So when I was writing Lucky Boy, I was telling the story of Soli, and I'd given her a town that I invented. I'd made up a name of a town, and I put it in nowhere, Mexico. And I didn't really understand where I was placing her regionally or culturally, whether it was a tiny town or a big city, or what that really meant. And it started very quickly to feel very fake. My story started to feel fake, and I started to lose some confidence. And the thing that I think saved my story was actually getting myself bodily to Mexico. I had an opportunity to stay at a small artist's residency, actually, in rural Oaxaca. And that was a real blessing. I stayed in this little town called San Jeronimo Tlacochuaya. And it was so important for me, I realized, to be in the environment that my character might have grown up in. I could feel the air. I could like smell the air. I could see the landscape. I could see what kinds of plants were around. I could see what the ground looked like. I got to meet some people who lived in this little town. I went to a town festival. And I started to feel like I had some sense of what Soli, my character, was leaving behind. Like she was leaving her home behind. And so often in immigrant narratives, we talk about the journey, we talk about the destination, but we don't talk as much about the origin. We don't talk about the love and the joy and the family in the place that our character is leaving behind. And this is another thing that was so important. I realized that when you're creating the humanity of a character, any character, it could be someone similar to you, it could be someone very different from you. It's really important to plug into their joy. Humanity does come out in moments of pain, but it is most consistent and I believe most powerful when we look at the joy and the daily living and the moment-to-moment experience of the majority of our characters' lives. Our characters live more in their joy and more in their daily life than they do in their scattered moments of pain. So I started to realize that when I stayed in this little town. Another way that my body really came into play when I was writing was with Boomi's Boombox. So Boomi, when she starts out, when we meet her, Boomi is a ballet student and she has just sort of flunked her audition to move on to the next level of her ballet school. So, I was writing this. I'd never danced ballet. I was always intrigued by it. And I was looking stuff up on YouTube and I was looking up like terms and trying to like teach myself. And then finally I was like, this is not working. Like I need to feel what it is to be a ballet dancer, even a bad ballet dancer or a beginner ballet dancer. I mean, I needed to feel it in my body. So I found an introduction, like an intro 1 class for adults at our local ballet theater, and I joined it. And I actually loved it. Like aside from all my writing, I just loved the practice. But I also was able to understand, how it feels to be perfectly in position as a ballet dancer, how it feels in your muscles and your tendons. I started to understand the instinctual way in which highly trained dancers dance. Like they don't look at their feet, they feel their feet, they feel when things are right. And that was important. That became really important for Boomi and her character. Next, we have eyes. Our characters have eyes and we as writers have eyes. More specifically, we have a lens. I have a lens, you have a lens. Our readers have lenses. So a lens is the scope, the vision through which we view the world. And we each have our own unique way of viewing the world, which is influenced by our gender, our race, our parents, our families, where we live, where we grew up. And we each write with that lens, and that lens, it shades what we're writing. So it's really important to understand that and to understand that we can't escape it. We're always going to have a certain slant to what we're writing, a certain inescapable prejudice even to what we're writing. But that slant can be used to our advantage in some sense. Again, going back to research, there are things that I, for example, don't use on a daily basis, but that a character of mine might. I call it the fork concept. So, we in the Western world tend to use forks and knives, and we just take it for granted. And there's a certain etiquette to using it, depending on what country you're in. There are things you do and you don't do. There's almost a whole folklore and custom around eating implements. If I were to write the story of someone in India, I would think about how they eat. Especially if I were writing an eating scene, I would think about how they eat. That often people in India eat with their right hand, and it's always the right hand. I mean, there are many, many customs and concepts around the very mundane act of eating. So you eat with your right hand. You ball up rice in the first half, the top half of your fingers. That's where you put food. You don't glop it down on your palm. You shovel the food into your mouth very neatly with your thumb. You don't trickle it in like that. There's this idea that when you're done with dinner, you're sitting around talking and the food is drying on your fingers and you're having a great conversation. And as soon as somebody gets up to wash their hands off, that's when the conversation peters out and starts to dry up. This is just one of those cultural stories that we tell ourselves. And so it's really important to get to know those daily, mundane, boring details, because they can often open up an understanding of the place and the people that you're trying to write about. Also, it's really important to accept your lens and its limitations. You will never be your character unless the character is modeled exactly on you. If you're writing outside of your experience, there'll be limitations. I wrote solely as a character, and I think that the books written by Mexican writers who maybe have a similar story to Soli's in some way or another, they go leagues beyond where I could go. And I just have to accept that. I can't be everything. I can't be everyone that I want to write. So I have to accept that. And I had to learn to make friends with my characters. I had to take Soli from being a stranger to being a friend. And it's kind of like getting to know a person that you've just met. You're sort of tiptoeing in. You're not blasting your way through and asking a zillion questions, right? You're just sort of letting them open themselves up to you. And that's what your characters will do if you give them the space of telling their story, doing some research, doing it carefully, and not just bazookaing your way through their story. Once I accepted this, I accepted my limitations. I then had to plug into what I actually knew and the ways in which I related, for example, to Soli. So Soli was a mother, and I'm a mother. And one way that I began to understand her was through that experience that we shared. I knew what it was like to be pregnant. I knew what it was like to go through labor and give birth and have a newborn. And that's where I connected with her. So you respect your points of difference, and then you plug into your points of connection with your character. That's really important. And some of these are just concepts that you keep in your mind, and they will hopefully feed how you write your story. And finally, I just have a bunch of question marks here. Questions when you're writing a book are everything. Uncertainty is everything, and uncertainty is your friend. I think, going back to the concept of cultural appropriation, the fastest road to cultural appropriation is blind certainty. to feel like you know and understand where your characters are coming from, what they're going through. I mean, that's when you start to trip up, because there's no way I, for example, could know what Soli was really going through, or someone like Soli was really going through. I could only do my best to tell that story. And writing a story anyway is just a process of asking questions. You know, literature opens up questions more than it answers them. And in many ways, that's the purpose that it serves. So accept your unknowns. Accept that you'll never write like a person who has lived the experience of your character. You never can. But you do have to ask yourself what you can bring to your character. What gifts can you as a writer bring to your character that nobody else can? And this is the ongoing question that you owe your story and that you owe yourself as a writer. So just to recap, here are my In Excess video cards. Why me? Why are you writing this story? The facts, get your research, get your statistics down. Voices, listen to people who have lived through what you're writing. The body, put yourself in any way you can, physically into the space that your character embodies. Try to understand them through physicality. The eyes, we all have a lens, and we need to use it, we need to respect it, and we need to respect its limitations. And then questions. Writing is a series of questions, and we don't always have the answers, but story lies in shadow, and sometimes that's where we have to live as writers. So thank you for your attention. I hope that that was really helpful, and it's been a pleasure talking to you. Bye.